Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Village Affairs by Miss Reed. Miss Reed and her friends are attending a lecture at the Corn Exchange in Caxley on birds by Mr. Maughan, who is, so to speak, all of a Twitter himself. Someone then looked at the clock and murmured that perhaps we should be moving. Henry Maughan's agitation returned. "The bill, waiter! Quickly, my dear fellow! We mustn't be late!" The waiter ambled off at a leisurely pace while we collected bags and gloves and various other impedimenta. And Henry Maughan started his pocket-slapping again in a frenzy of finding his checkbook. "Henry," said his wife, with a look that could have stopped a rogue elephant at its tracks, "calm down. You know perfectly well that I have the checkbook in my handbag. Now, if you will make sure that you have your notes and your bifocals, I will take charge of the account and meet you outside." We gave our sincere thanks to the Maughans for the delicious lunch as we made our way to the Corn Exchange. The Caxley Market Square was gay with stalls, and I should dearly have loved to buy some eggs and cheese from my favorite stallholder. But this was not the time, I realized, to clutch a piece of ripe gorgonzola for an hour and a half. The hall was half full, which was a creditable number to assemble on a Saturday afternoon. As we were the speaker's party, we were shown to the front row. On the way to our august places, I was delighted to catch sight of a contingent from Beech Green. Among the party, I saw George and Isabel Annett and dear Miss Clare, who taught for many years at Fairacre School, sitting with them. I was seated by Mrs. Maughan, who remained completely unmoved by the pathetic sight of her husband trying to arrange his papers with shaking hands. The chairman was the president of Caxley's Nature Conservancy Trust and was doing his best to put Henry at his ease before starting the meeting. He might just as well have saved his breath, for Henry took not the slightest notice and brought matters to a climax by dropping all his papers on the floor. With startled cries, the two men bent to retrieve them, cracking their skulls together, thus occasioning further cries from the audience. The papers were collected, Henry shuffled them together with a look of utter despair, and the chairman rose to introduce him. Once Henry was on his feet and the clapping had died away, he became wonderfully calm and happy. He smiled at us all as though he were truly glad to tell us about the birds which gave such zest and joy to his life. It was difficult to believe that less than half an hour ago he had been as nervous as a fretful baby. It was an enthralling talk, and the slides were superb. When he ended, the audience applauded enthusiastically. Clearly, here was a man who was master of his subject and able to transmit his own excitement to others. As we drove home again, Diana Hale summed up the feelings of all of us. "He's a man who can make you forget your own world and carry you into his." With a start, I realized how true this was. For the first time in weeks, I had forgotten the shadow which hung menacingly over my future, and gratitude mingled with my admiration for our old friend Henry Maughan. Chapter 9. Mrs. Pringle Goes to War. Minnie Pringle continued to wreak havoc in my house every Friday afternoon. I did my best to forestall trouble, but was far from successful. Now that I realized that she could not read, I tried to put out the bottles and tins she would need for any specific job. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes such bottles as that containing window-cleaning liquid would be put in the bathroom cabinet beside the witch hazel or gargle. It was all a little unnerving. My vacuum cleaner was maltreated weekly by having its cord twisted tightly into figures of 8 round the handle, and the plug became so cracked with being dropped on the tiled floor of the kitchen, I was obliged to renew it. Maddening though she was, I did not want to find Minnie electrocuted on my premises. She also had a peculiar way with dusters. Somewhere along the extensive line of previous employers, she had picked up the wholly admirable habit of washing the dusters before leaving work. Unfortunately, how to dry them seemed to be beyond her. I had indicated a small line conveniently near to the back door, but this was ignored. Sometimes she hung a wet duster on the newel post at the foot of the stairs, so that anyone mounting clapped her hand upon the clammy object. When remonstrated with, Minnie changed her tactics and draped them along the newly polished dining room table or over the padded back of an armchair. Irritation gave way to incredulity, and I used to return to my home on Friday afternoons wondering what Minnie had got up to this time. There was always something untoward to greet me. If there were not some new place for the dusters to dry, then it might be a few broken shards of a favorite cup, carefully arranged on a half-sheet of newspaper on the draining board. At least she did not try to cover up her little mishaps with my property. I supposed it was something to be thankful for, but I longed for the day when Minnie's future took her far, far away. Her own domestic affairs seemed to be shrouded in mystery. I had heard rumors about Mrs. Fowler and her new paramour, and some said that she was asserting her authority to such an extent that it was likely that Minnie's husband might return to his wife and his children. Others said that Minnie, too, was finding consolation elsewhere, and that the under-gardener at Springbourne Manor had been seen leaving Minnie's premises at some very odd times. I rarely saw Minnie, only the results of her labors, and that was quite enough for me. Mrs. Pringle, who usually volunteered any village news, was unusually taciturn these days, and I put it down to the debilitating effects of the diet. Not that she seemed any thinner, but she was certainly paler, and her limp seemed to be permanent these days. I ventured to ask how the dieting was progressing one day. "You wants to ask Dr. Martin," she said sourly. "It's him what does the worrying. I told him straight, them scales of yourn are wrong, but he never batted an eyelid. He reckons I've only lost another 2 pound after all this time. Not my fault, you know. I sticks to what's writ down." It did seem odd. "Of course I eats what afore me, and if I'm invited out, stands to reason. You can't offend people when they're slaved over a hot stove, getting a nice bit of roast pork and potatoes ready, and a good suet pudding to follow." "But do you go out often?" "Twice a week to my sister's, and of course I have her back and have to do much the same for her." "That can't help," I felt obliged to point out. Mrs. Pringle bridled. "I've halved my chocolate. I'm used to what we knew as a tuppenny bar in the old days after my tea. Well, I makes that do for 2 days now, and I only takes 1 spoonful of sugar instead of 2 in my tea. No call for Dr. Martin to be so sharp with me, I tell him. After all, I'm still losing weight, aren't I?" I began to feel sorry for Dr. Martin. "Couldn't you use those sweeteners instead of sugar, and perhaps have half an apple instead of the chocolate?" Mrs. Pringle looked at me as if I were an earwig discovered in the bedclothes. "And start my heartburn up again. It's plain to see, Miss Reed, as you and Doc Martin is hand in glove. If you wants me to go on working here day in, day out, giving my best and my heart's blood to this here thankless job, then I must have a bit of nourishing food." She made her way to the door, limping heavily. I said no more. I know when I am beaten. The second half of the summer term brought some of the hottest weather of the century. Day after day dawned clear and cloudless, and by 10:30 in the morning it was beginning to get too hot for comfort outside. Our ancient schoolroom was one of the coolest places in the village. With its lofty ceiling and high windows, it was remarkably airy, and the gnarled elder trees, which tapped against the west-facing windows, cast a green shade which was more than welcome. The door was propped open permanently to let in any stray breeze. It also let in Tibby, much to the rapture of the children, and an assortment of wildlife ranging from wasps, which threw the children into violent demonstrations of assumed fear, to butterflies, and, once, a field mouse. The latter threw me into a transport of fear, which was certainly not assumed, but which I tried to hide from the children. My efforts were not completely successful. "Shall I whack it on the head?" inquired Ernest, advancing with his geography reader in hand. "No, no," I said hastily. After all my exhortations on kindness to animals, it was disappointing to see Ernest's bloodthirsty reaction to the intruder. "It will find its way out in a minute." Nose twitching, it scampered along by the map cupboard, watched by the class. I observed its movements with inward horror. Suppose it turned in my direction. As luck would have it, Patrick gave an enormous sneeze, which sent it bolting from the room and out once again to the field from which it had emerged. I breathed again. The afternoons were so hot that it was impossible to expect much in the way of work from the children. The older ones went by school bus to Caxley once a week for swimming, and were the envy of all those left behind to swelter in the heat of Fairacre. I did my best to make their lot easier by taking them outside. We have one particularly fine beech tree near the edge of the field which borders the playground, and here the shade was deep and refreshing on those baking afternoons. I read them folk tales and let them lie as they pleased, flat on their backs or lodged on an elbow, their hair lifting in the light wind that stirred the leaves above them. What did it matter if they heard little of the story? On those golden afternoons they absorbed more than any printed page could give them. Happy summer memories which would remain with them for a lifetime. Whether it was the heat or Mrs. Pringle's growing touchiness, or a combination of both, which triggered off the great row between that lady and the inoffensive Mrs. Rose, it is impossible to say. It began one hot after-dinner session, and the battleground was the lobby at the back of the school where Mrs. Pringle does the washing up. It is usually a peaceful period, preceding the afternoon session and occasionally running into the first lesson. I am quite used to giving out handwork material to a background of clashing cutlery, and Mrs. Pringle's contralto rendering of the more lugubrious numbers from hymns ancient and modern. The first I heard was the sound of infants on the move next door. They were obviously surging toward the door leading into the lobby. Adult voices were raised, one shrill, one booming. The latter was only too familiar to me, but I could not think who the other shrill-voiced contestant could be. Daring my children to bat an eyelid, I strode forth to investigate. "Into your seats this minute!" I bellowed as Mrs. Rose's excited children were milling round the door. Reluctantly they obeyed, and I posted the largest infant at the front to tell me on my return who had been the quietest. The battle was gaining in volume, and speed of action was behind me. It was now plain that Mrs. Rose was engaged in combat with Mrs. Pringle, and I quaked at the thought of what I might see by, or even under, the lobby sink. There was something Wagnerian about the sight which met my eyes. Steam from the washing-up bowl wreathed the forms of the two martial bodies. Mrs. Pringle held a saucepan aloft, as though about to cleave Mrs. Rose's skull some inches below her own. Mrs. Rose, her normally pale face suffused with blotchy red patches, clung to Mrs. Pringle's flowered overall and screamed her head off. "Ladies!" I shouted. It seemed a singularly inappropriate title to bestow upon the two viragos before me, but was the best I could manage. At least it had the desired effect, and the combatants parted and faced me, bosoms heaving and eyes flashing. They were too winded with warfare to speak. "What on earth," I said sternly, "are you two doing? You are frightening the life out of the children." This was not strictly true. Even now some bold bad infants had crept to the doorway and were surveying the scene with every appearance of joy. This little contretemps would soon be common knowledge in Fairacre, I surmised. "Stand back," I hissed. "Into your seat this instant." The very idea. This last phrase, idiotic though it may be, has an uncanny power over the young, if expressed forcibly. It worked yet again, and the faces vanished. Mrs. Rose tidied her hair and without a word followed her pupils, leaving Mrs. Pringle muttering malevolently to herself. I don't know what all that was about, and I don't want to know, I said loftily, but if it happens again, we shall have to look for another cleaner. And you'll be lucky to get one with that old cat on the premises, boomed Mrs. Pringle, as I departed with as much dignity as I could muster. Mrs. Rose was tying a shoelace with trembling fingers as I passed through the infant's room on the way to my own. Sorry about that, she whispered. I'll tell you all at playtime. A rare silence had fallen upon her class. They gazed upon her round-eyed. I left her to face the infants alone. My own children were equally silent, but their eyes were bright with expectation. See if you can stay as quiet as that for the next 10 minutes, I said frostily, propping myself on the edge of the table and trying to regain my composure. Long-suffering looks were exchanged. Obviously not a word of explanation was going to be given them. Was there no justice? I saw Mrs. Pringle departing soon afterwards, her black bag swinging on her arm, her stout back registering martyrdom, and her limp much in evidence. Mrs. Rose, calmer now, told me about the cause of the fuss as we sipped our tea in the playground. The real culprits were some new babies who had emptied their dinner scraps into the wrong bucket. It was as simple as that. From time immemorial, Mrs. Pringle has taken home a dank parcel of plate scrapings for her chickens. This is one of the many uses to which her black oilcloth bag is pressed. One bucket stands beneath the sink for such revolting leftovers as fat trimmings, tough morsels of cabbage stalk, and so on, combined with gobbets of custard, jelly, or pastry from the second course. Sometimes, turning from this receptacle with nausea, I am reminded of the tubs which are reputed to have been left outside the gates of Blenheim Palace years ago for the poor of Woodstock. It took an American duchess to suggest that at least the savory matter could be put in a separate container from the sweet. Mrs. Pringle's chickens are not so fortunate, but they appear to thrive on what they get. The second bucket contains the true rubbish destined for the dustbin, along with the contents of the waste paper baskets. What had happened was that 4 or 5 innocents had scraped their plates into the latter, and such delicacies as half-chewed gristle, dear to the hearts of Mrs. Pringle's hens, were in danger of being thrown out. Nagged by pain from her empty stomach, Mrs. Pringle reacted furiously to this scandalous filching from her hungry hens, and began berating the poor babies, who soon began to weep. Mrs. Rose, as zealous for her children as Mrs. Pringle was for her chickens, rushed to their defense, and the ugly scene then ensued. She had no business to shout at the children like that, asserted Mrs. Rose, pink with the memory, nor at me. I've never in my life been subjected to such impertinence. I think you could have been a little more tolerant, I said mildly. You know what Mrs. Pringle is, and since this confounded dieting, she's been twice as touchy. She's not going to yell at my babies and get away with it. I shall expect an apology. You won't get it. And of course she didn't. Mrs. Pringle wrapped herself in majestic silence, and so did Mrs. Rose, so that the atmosphere fairly quivered with taut nerves whenever the two ladies were in the same room. It was a trying time for us all, and the fact that nothing more had been said one way or the other about Fairacre School's possible closure I found particularly unnerving. More measuring had been going on at Beech Green School, according to Mr. Annett, but otherwise he too was in the dark. I think it will all blow over, he told me one sunny Friday evening. He had called in before choir practice to lend me an American treatise on educating young children, which he thought I might enjoy. I had not the heart to tell him that any book more than 3 inches thick, with footnotes, 5 appendices, killed any desire to read it from the start. A quick look inside had confirmed my suspicions that this one had been written in the brain-numbing sort of jargon I cannot abide. There was no doubt about it. It was one of those books one keeps safely for a decent interval, dusts, and returns, praying that the lender refrains from asking any questions about it. After all, he continued, it always has before. Why should they close Fairacre at this particular moment? I don't know, but the numbers are dwindling. We're down to 26 this term, and somehow there was a look in Mr. Salisbury's eyes which I didn't like. He's always got that, said George cheerfully. Comes of working in an office all day. He put down his glass and sprang nimbly to his feet. I sighed and rose too. You sound uncommonly sad, he said. Old age? Probably. How long notice would I get, do you think, if they do decide to close? Years. Honestly? Really years? I believe so. Why, you'd probably be about to retire anyway by the time they get around to it. We walked together toward the church. The lime trees buzzed with scores of bees, and the scent from the creamy flowers was delicious, the essence of summer. Fairacre seemed very dear and sweet. You've got a good spot here, said George, as if reading my thoughts. None better, I told him, as bravely as I could. And we'll look further into the destiny of Fairacre next time.